So maybe we can start again. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Kadri Vihvelin. So Kadri Vihvelin is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Southern California, and her research interests include free will, determinism, causation, counterfactuals, and time travel. And her book, Causes, Laws, and Free Will, Why Determinism Doesn't Matter, was published in 2013 by Oxford University Press. So, Professor Vihvelin.
Thank you. My talk is a little bit long, so I'm going to read rather than talk it in the hopes that it will go faster that way. The free will determinism problem is usually presented as a problem about the compatibility of laws of a certain kind, deterministic, with a special property of human beings, free will. And many people assume, sometimes on the basis of argument, sometimes because it seems obvious to them, that determinism is incompatible with free will. Some say that determinism rules out not just free will, but moral responsibility. Others disagree, claiming that we might be responsible even if deterministic laws rule out all alternative possibilities and thus all free will. And so the debate goes, always for very high stakes, because free will and moral responsibility matter a great deal to us. I want to take a different approach. I think the problem is more general. I think that the free will determinism problem is, most fundamentally, a problem about the apparent conflict between the way things are at a deterministic universe and our common sense beliefs about causation, our causal powers, and the causal powers of ordinary objects like hammers and baseballs. In order to make progress in the free will determinism problem, we must first understand causation better. To understand causation better, we need to understand the relation between causation, counterfactuals, and laws. I think for reasons I will give later that we should be surprised by how quick we are to conclude that the truth of determinism means the absence of free will. After all, we already know that we are physical beings in a physical world, subject to the same laws that apply to everything else in the universe. We know that the laws set limits on our abilities, our possibilities, and our powers of choice and agent causation. We don't think that our causal powers somehow transcend the laws or include the power to break or change the laws. We accept these limits while still believing that we are agents with free will. Yet determinism, when explained in a philosophy or science classroom, tends to make us think that we have no free will. We need an explanation for why we move so quickly from our cheerful acceptance of the fact that our powers of free will and agency are limited without being eliminated by the physical world and its laws, to the conclusion that if these laws turn out to be deterministic, we have no free will at all. I better put my cards on the table. I'm a compatibilist. I think that we do have free will, and by this I mean, among other things, that we are often in situations where we are able to choose and also to act otherwise. I think, and have argued at length in many places, that there are no good arguments for the dire conclusion that the truth of determinism means the absence of free will. But I do not deny that the intuitions are powerful. In an essay written way back in 1934 with the great title, Free Will as Involving Determinism and Inconceivable Without It, Hobart said that our incompatibilist intuitions are due to a failure of the analytic imagination. He compared our failure to understand how we might be free-willed agents at a deterministic world to the failure of a group of village folk to understand how a steam engine works. Even after they had listened to a long lecture on how the parts fit together to make the engine work, they asked if there was a horse inside. There is clearly something to Hobart's diagnosis. The notorious disappearing agent objection to causal theories of action is a classic case of Hobart's horse inside the engine mistake. But I don't think that that is all there is to it. Determinism is a thesis about the laws. It is not a thesis about causation or causal explanation. And yet, a very common response to determinism is to think that it undermines our common sense beliefs not only about free will, but also about causation, Why is this? I'll be arguing that the answer lies in an assumption we make about counterfactuals. That's the first part, and actually probably most of my talk. The second part is an argument that we should reject the current dominant theory of counterfactuals, David Lewis's small miracles theory, in favor of an account that holds the laws constant. I will be recommending the simple theory defended by Jonathan Bennett in 1984. I do not claim that the simple theory makes it easier to defend compatibilism. I think that compatibilism is true, but I don't claim it's easy to defend. My claim is that for reasons that have nothing to do with the free will determinism problem, we should reject Lewis's small miracles theory in favor of Bennett's simple theory. We should adopt Bennett's theory because it's a better theory of counterfactuals. But I also think, though I probably won't have time to argue, that the simple theory provides us with the tools we need to think more clearly about the free will determinism problem. I will begin by saying something about our beliefs about our causal powers and how we acquire those beliefs. When we try to figure out what to do, from deciding what to have for lunch to the big decisions that shape our lives, we assume that we are choosing from some range of alternatives. And we assume that we are able to choose any of these alternatives and that it's up to us which one we choose. We believe that we have the power to decide by using a process of conscious, rational deliberation, but we also believe that whether we use this power is up to us. We could just flip a coin. Even when we aren't trying to decide what to do, we think of ourselves with the power, as agents with the power to do things that make a difference to the world around us. Our powers are, of course, limited by the size and shape of our bodies, by our skills and physical capacities, and by the situations in which we find ourselves. And of course, by the laws of nature and the past. We can't make bread from stone, part the Red Sea, or run faster than the speed of light. And we can't do anything to change the past, including those actions we now regret. Nevertheless, within these broad limits, we believe that we have the power to move our bodies in ways that cause some things to happen and prevent others. By throwing a baseball, you're able to break a window. By catching the ball before it reaches the window, I'm able to prevent the window from breaking. We think of these powers of causing and preventing as being under our control in the following way. When we cause or prevent an outcome, we didn't have to do what we did. What we did was up to us. We were able to do otherwise. Doing otherwise was in our power. We had a choice. We also believe that we sometimes have control over outcomes that we ourselves do not cause. To continue with the baseball story, suppose that I see you lift the baseball and take aim at the window. I'm standing between you and the window, catcher's mitt in hand, and I have plenty of time to raise my mitt and intercept the ball. But I think it would be fun to watch the window breaking, so I don't. I don't cause you to throw the ball, and it doesn't seem right to say that I caused the window to break. But it does seem right to say that I allowed it to break. And part of what we believe, when we believe this, is that I had the power to do something that would have prevented the window from breaking. I'm skipping over a bit here. What these ways of thinking about ourselves as causes have in common is that they assume some difference between what we actually do, how we actually deliberate, choose, act, and cause, and what we are able to do, our powers of deliberation, choice, agency, and causation. Our belief that we have powers which are ours to use or squander is not just a belief we have when we occupy the standpoint of first-person deliberation. It's a belief we have when we look back and judge that we made a wrong or foolish choice or missed a great opportunity, and it's a belief that we have about others. These beliefs, let's call them beliefs about our powers of agent causation, matter to us. Very different views of life have in common that we live a good life by making the most of what has been given to us, our genetic endowment, the family we were born into, our talents, opportunities, and the chances that come our way in life. We admire those who have done much with little, and we criticize those who have wasted great native talents and frittered away their abundant opportunities. How do we acquire these beliefs about our powers? Here's my small, not very controversial conjecture. We acquire these beliefs at the same time and in the same way that we acquire our beliefs about causation more generally. We begin as babies and young children by learning that we are able to control the movements of our own bodies, and to use them to manipulate nearby objects and to thereby cause changes in these objects and in our environment. A baby uses her hands to pick up a rattle and discovers that when she shakes the rattle, it makes a certain kind of noise. She moves her hands a certain way, the noise starts. She stops moving them that way, the noise stops. She shakes her teddy bear, no noise. She squeezes the teddy bear, a different kind of noise. And the baby thereby learns both that the teddy bear and the rattle make these kinds of sounds when manipulated a certain way, and that she's able to produce those sounds by manipulating them in these ways. By experimenting in these ways, we gradually learn the truth of counterfactuals of the following sort. If I had not moved my body like that, that object, the rattle, the teddy bear, would not have done that. As we learn more about the causal powers of the particular objects around us, and at the same time about our own causal powers, we acquire beliefs in more counterfactuals, and we progress from beliefs about particular objects to counterfactual generalizations about similar objects. We acquire this counterfactual knowledge not only by noticing which manipulations produce changes in which kinds of objects, but also by noticing how objects of certain kinds persist unchanged or change on their own in the absence of our interventions. We learn that scissors are good at cutting paper, not so good at cutting cloth or wood. We learn that balls tend to roll down sloped surfaces unless blocked by some other object, and so on. As our ability to predict the characteristic behaviors of objects increases, we acquire the ability to prevent things from happening. We see a ball rolling down a hill, we put our foot in front of it, preventing it from reaching the bottom. We see a plate teetering on a counter and grab it before it falls and breaks. An older child might realize that a younger child is in danger and reach out and grab the child before she falls or touches something sharp or hot. And once we understand what it is to prevent something from happening, that is, once we understand how to anticipate an outcome that would have happened had we not intervened, we can also understand what it is to allow an outcome. For to allow an outcome is to fail to prevent some outcome that we could have prevented. More specifically, when we allow an outcome, there was some way of moving our bodies such that we were able, then and there, to move our body that way, and had we done so, the outcome would not have occurred. The do-allow distinction is thought to be a philosophically problematic one, and I do not claim here to have given a philosophical account of it. My claim is only that our ordinary talk about what people do and cause appears to be committed to such a distinction, that our ordinary beliefs about what people allow are tied to beliefs about the outcomes they could have prevented, and that this could is a could of a power of agent causation. I think that we apply the same distinction when we think about our powers with respect to our future selves. We speak of people overcoming adversity and a terrible childhood and making their own character by sheer force of will and, of course, a bit of luck. But we also speak of people who let their characters deteriorate and allow themselves to fall into bad habits. To sum up, I have described our common sense beliefs about the ways in which we are actual and potential causes of a wide variety of events and states of affairs. The most interesting metaphysical commitment of these beliefs is that we have somehow or other causal powers that persist during times that we are not exercising them. This belief is, I've argued, a highly robust one, and one that is embedded in our ordinary talk of allowing various kinds of things to happen, undesirable consequences, our own actions, our future selves. But, and this is key, it's also vague in crucial respects, in the way that common sense beliefs tend to be. Nothing that I have said supports the claim that common sense has a metaphysical view about the nature of these powers. So far as common sense is concerned, it might be that our agential powers require determinism or indeterminism or are compatible with both. And yet, when we learn what the thesis of determinism says, and are asked to take seriously the thought that science might tell us that determinism is true, we respond with horror and what I call the 3 stages of denial. Here I refer you to the handout for some of the standard ways of formulating determinism. The first one, the no exception claim, is only an approximation, and the other 3 formulations differ in various ways. The modal formulation is the strongest of the 3. The entailment formulation is the one that is standardly used. But it doesn't really matter which definition is used, so long as they are clearly explained. The first stage of denial is the incredulous stare. Determinism can't be true. It literally makes no sense. The second stage is misinterpretation. Determinism is almost determinism. All events are governed by deterministic laws except for our choices. The third stage, after we finally understand that determinism really means determinism, is an extreme form of hard determinism. Everything that happens is necessary. Everything that doesn't happen is impossible. We have no free will and no causal power. It isn't really us, or for that matter, horses or steam engines or baseballs, that does the causing. It's just the laws making everything happen. I'm not making this up. I've been teaching the free will determinism problem in an introductory semester-long class to undergraduates for almost 20 years. It took me a while to recognize it, but I am now confident that I'm correctly reporting a common reaction. The horror and shock come in the move from the first vague, no exception statement of the thesis of determinism to the standard Laplacian and entailment definitions. After explaining determinism very carefully to make sure there is no misinterpretation, when I first started doing this, it took me as much as a month, during which time the students all became very depressed and grouchy. I spent a lot of time explaining the difference between predictability, truth, and necessity. I devoted an entire class, sometimes 2 classes, to fatalist fallacies. I also spend a lot of time talking about causation and why determinism doesn't mean there is no causation. None of this helps. Well, at least initially. I mean, more recent years, I've had a little bit more success in explaining compatibilism and in motivating students to consider the possibility that we might have free will, even if determinism turns out to be true, and motivating them to try to exercise their analytic imaginations. And being the mostly very nice kids this generation seems to be, they really do try, but I could tell it isn't easy. So, my question is, why this response? Now, I know that some of you might not be persuaded that there is anything problematic, because you already think that some version of the third stage, hard determinism, is correct. So let me say a bit why I think this conclusion is not warranted. I'm skipping over the section in the handout called Some Claims About Causation, but I'll be happy to answer questions about this. I'm now going to say a bit about how the laws constrain and how they leave us free. We begin our philosophical theorizing with some common sense data, which we ignore at our peril. Here is one datum about the laws of nature, which any adequate theory must accommodate somehow or other. The laws constrain us and everything else in the universe in a substantive way. There are some things we are not able to do because of the laws. Knowing what the laws are gives us useful, non-trivial information about what we're able to do. This is distinct from 2 other kinds of constraint: the constraints of logic, broadly understood, and the constraints that distinguish individuals from one another. Now, it's logically impossible to square a circle, to stay home all day while also leaving the house that day, to bring it about that there are exactly 10 people in a certain room at a certain time, and also fewer than 8 people in that room at that time. We're not able to do or cause any of these things. If we tried, we would fail. No matter how hard we tried, no matter how many times we tried, no matter how ingenious our efforts were. Nor would we be able to do something logically impossible if the laws of nature were somehow different. Our inability is due to logic, broadly understood, not the laws. It isn't logically impossible for me to speak Chinese, walk a tightrope without falling more or less immediately, or to run a mile in less than 5 minutes. Nor do the laws of nature rule this out, for the world is filled with Chinese speakers, tightrope walkers, and fast runners. And I might even acquire these abilities myself someday, but I'm nevertheless not able to do these things now. If I tried, I'd fail. And my failure wouldn't be a mere fluke or something we might call bad luck. I would fail no matter how hard I try or how many times I would try. I would fail because I don't, given the way I am now, have what it takes to do any of these things. Given the way I am now, the laws preclude my doing any of these things. It isn't logically impossible for me to accelerate to a speed faster than the speed of light, but the laws say that no one and nothing does. And because of this, no human being is able to win a race with a light beam, no matter what. It makes no difference how good a runner you are, how long you train, or how hard you try. Your failure is actually and counterfactually guaranteed by the laws. There are possible worlds where the laws of physics are different, and even different enough to permit faster than light acceleration. And there may be possible worlds where you or your counterpart is able to run fast in the speed of light. But the laws that govern the actual universe, our laws, dictate that you will never acquire this ability, nor are you ever able to acquire this ability. There's nothing that you are now able to do in the way that you're now able to take a Chinese course, join a circus class, or start running every day, such that if you did it long enough and seriously enough, you would eventually acquire the ability to run faster than the speed of light. Any adequate account of laws must draw a distinction between the history of a particular fact at a world and the laws of that world. For instance, it may be true that no one ever has or ever will read all of the Oxford English Dictionary aloud. But this proposition, even if true, is not a law. And any adequate account of laws must be able to make sense of the idea that worlds with different histories of particular fact conform to the same laws. And that's enough to provide us with the resources for saying the things we want to say about how the laws limit our causal powers. We can define a set of laws L, how do we get them? From physics, such that L is the set consisting of all the laws of our world, and we can define a set of worlds W consisting of all the worlds correctly described by L. Call these the physically possible worlds. Given this distinction between what actually happens, the total history of events at our world, and what is physically possible, the total history of events at some physically possible world, we can define a physically possible event or sequence of events E as follows. E is physically possible if there is some physically possible world where E occurs. And we can define a physically impossible event or sequence of events as follows. E is physically impossible just in case there is no physically possible world where E occurs. With this in place, we can now understand how the laws constrain. Nothing in the universe, including us, has the ability or power, capacity, capability, disposition, and so on, to do or cause any event or sequence of events that is physically impossible. So, for instance, suppose it's true that no one ever has or ever will read all of the Oxford English Dictionary aloud, but since it's not a law, there are physically possible worlds where someone succeeds in accomplishing this apparently pointless task. It doesn't follow, of course, that any actual human being has the ability to read the OED out loud. But if we lack this ability, it's not because of the laws. By contrast, it's both true and a law that nothing accelerates to a speed greater than the speed of light, so there is no physically possible world where any human being runs faster than light. And every human being lacks this ability and lacks it because of the laws. What I've just said should be uncontroversial. You should agree, regardless of what you believe about the nature of laws, and regardless of your views concerning the free will determinism problem. You should agree that the laws impose substantive, non-trivial limits on what we're able to do, regardless of whether you're a compatibilist, incompatibilist, or impossibilist. But there are limits to how the laws constrain. The laws do not dictate all the details of the initial conditions of the universe, nor do they dictate all the details of how the world must be at any given time. This is so even at a deterministic universe. If we claim that a person in a deterministic universe has the ability at a particular time to do something other than she actually does, we do not thereby contradict the uncontroversial claim that I just described about how the laws constrain. The incompatibilist needs an argument that there is an additional constraint at every deterministic world, and that this additional constraint robs us of the free will we would otherwise have, rendering us always unable to do otherwise. Now, there are, of course, such arguments, most notably the consequence argument. I think that these arguments all fail, but that's not my topic today. In my experience, the uninitiated, my students, don't need to be given an argument for incompatibilism. Once they understand what the thesis of determinism really says, and it does take them a while to grasp that, they are already incompatibilists of a particularly extreme variety. My question again is, why do they respond this way? Why is compatibilism a belief that has to be acquired by hard work? Shouldn't the truth be easier to believe? And why do we think that the truth of determinism would mean that our common sense beliefs about causation are all false? So, one natural thought is that our resistance to determinism can be explained by our experience of making choices. When we try to decide what to do, we choose among possible ways of acting. And when we do this, we have a certain kind of experience. The experience of being able to act in either of two or more incompatible ways, given the entire state of the world just before we decide. But this is not something that experience can tell us. At best, experience can tell us that we can sometimes choose either of two incompatible courses of action given our current beliefs, desires, and intentions, and perhaps some other psychological facts about us. Richard Holton has suggested that our experience of choice might give rise to the belief that determinism is false by way of an illicit inductive leap from the belief that we can do otherwise, given our beliefs, desires, and intentions, to the belief that we can do otherwise, given the entire state of the world at the time just before we choose. This may well be true, but it doesn't explain what I'm trying to explain. What I'm trying to explain is not that we believe that determinism is actually false. I'm trying to explain why we think it must be false in order for us to have free will and the causal powers that we've taken for granted for most of our lives. I think that the explanation lies in certain counterfactuals that we assert, entertain, and believe true in situations that I call choice situations. Choice situations may be, but need not be, situations in which we have the experience of making a choice. We have the experience of making a choice in situations where we don't immediately know what to do, situations in which we need to make up our mind by considering our options and choosing the one we think best or which most appeals. You are standing before the counter at the ice cream parlor, gazing at the 25 different flavors, trying to decide which one you want. You are at a fork in the road, faced with a choice between the scenic, winding coastal route and the boring but speedy freeway. You are faced with a more difficult choice between competing job offers or houses. But choice situations also include situations in which we don't stop to think, either because a situation calls for a quick response or because we already know what to do. We learned long ago that putting our finger on the hot burner is not a good idea, that stopping at red lights is a good idea, and so on. I count these as choice situations because even if the person did not act by first making a decision, it seems that the person could have done so. Some examples. You're driving your car when a squirrel suddenly runs in the path of the car. To avoid hitting the squirrel, you could apply your brakes, swerve, or keep driving in the hope that the car will pass over the squirrel without hitting it. You have less than a second to decide. You keep driving. You walk into a room just in time to see a child reaching for a knife that has been left on a counter. Without pausing to think, you run over to stop the child. These choice situations differ from each other in a variety of ways, but I think they all deserve the name. Looking back, we say things like, I'm glad that's what I chose to do, or if I had known then what I know now, I wouldn't have done that. But these are not situations in which we have the experience of considering and choosing between different options. Choice situations are ubiquitous. We've been in choice situations our entire lives, from the time we were babies, performing simple versions of scientific experiments in our attempts to find out how the world works. We learned about causation by being in choice situations. What all choice situations have in common is that we believe that certain kinds of counterfactuals are true. When we deliberate, even briefly, for the purpose of deciding whether to do A or B, we begin our decision-making by asking certain kinds of counterfactual questions. What would happen if I did A? What would happen if I did B? More generally, what would the world be like if I did A? What would the world be like if I did B? We are good at entertaining and evaluating these kinds of counterfactuals, and we think of them as objective in certain kinds of ways. We use them as a basis of our advice to others and as a basis for some of our interventions with others. We run over to stop the child from grabbing the knife because we believe that if she got hold of it, she would hurt herself. And we use them to criticize others, ourselves and others, for making foolish decisions and poor choices. Our evaluation of counterfactuals and our counterfactual reasoning is based on an implicit understanding of what facts we should hold constant and what facts we should vary. When we ask what would be the case if we or someone else were to perform one of the acts we or they are contemplating doing. When we ask afterwards what would have been the case if we or they had done something else instead. There are two main categories of facts we feel entitled to take for granted in these kinds of counterfactual speculations. Facts about the past and facts about the laws. And here I include rough and ready ones like rocks thrown at windows tend to break them, and squirrels struck by fast-moving cars usually die. Now, we don't have any official story about how we evaluate counterfactuals. If we have any story, it might be the one, I forget who claimed that counterfactuals are like short stories. You just begin at the beginning and then go to the end without worrying about how the world got to be that way. But when we learn about determinism, we're forced to think about entire possible worlds. And at that point, we realize, or think we realize, that we've been counterfactually reasoning as if determinism were false. We've reasoned as if the laws in the past would be the same, no matter what we choose and do. It is this belief about counterfactuals that lies behind common metaphors like the future is a garden of forking paths, and the vague idea that we move through time in something like the way we move down a road. So our freedom, is a quote, is the freedom to add to the given past in accordance with the laws. These common but otherwise mysterious beliefs are, I think, based on our beliefs about counterfactuals true in choice situations. We might call this theory of counterfactuals a legal forks theory, but for reasons that will soon be clear, I will call it the naive theory. My claim is that our strong intuitive resistance to determinism and our subsequent extreme hard determinism is due to the conflict between determinism and the naive theory of counterfactuals. We are in choice situations every day, and it seems we rely on the naive theory for our evaluations of the relevant counterfactuals. But if determinism is true, the naive theory is false. However, we know that we make and criticize choices by using the naive theory, and we can't imagine doing it any other way. So our first response to determinism is to deny that it could possibly be true. This is a perfect instance of Hobart's failure of the analytic imagination. Forced by our philosophy or neuroscience professor to take determinism more seriously, we reluctantly admit that we can't rule out the possibility of determinism or something close enough being true, at least so far as our brains and bodies are concerned. But we make an exception for our choices because, after all, experience tells us that we choose, and to choose, surely, is to be able to choose in more than one way. So the next step is to understand determinism as almost determinism, that is, determinism except for our choices. But that doesn't help. We now reason as follows. Okay, so determinism doesn't mean I have no free will. But determinism means that my choices never make any difference to the physical world, for if I chose otherwise, the laws in the past, including the entire state of my brain and body, would still be the same. And if my brain doesn't tell my body to move differently, it won't move differently. And here we may have the seeds for something like Kim's exclusion argument. And thus, the second stage of denial is an epiphenomenal version of dualism. Our choices have no sufficient physical causes, but they also have no physical effects. If we are in a philosophy classroom, we eventually move to the third stage of denial. We come to understand that determinism is a thesis without any exceptions, that every instance of human action, including choice-making, is governed by strict deterministic laws. Our professor will try to explain that this doesn't preclude our choices from being causes as well as effects, and will try to explain some version of compatibilism, but we will remain dismayed, for it will now seem clear that there are no non-vacuous counterfactuals, or perhaps we will conclude that counterfactual reasoning no longer makes sense. Baumeister on the handout is a perfect example of this. There are no counterfactuals, he asserts. Either way, it will seem that we cannot deliberate in the way that we are accustomed to doing. And while we might nod and agree that, of course, we still make choices, and our choices still cause our bodies to move in the ways appropriate to action, this won't mean what it used to mean. We don't have the causal powers we always thought we had. The causal power in the universe is located in the laws and the remote past, not us. We will reluctantly conclude that determinism is true and free will is an illusion. Okay, this is the end of the free will part of my paper. I will now, as briefly as I can, turn to counterfactuals. Okay, suppose we live in a deterministic world. This, it is generally agreed, does not mean there are no non-vacuously true counterfactuals. But it does mean that the naive theory is false and that legal forks is false. We need a better theory. We need a theory that can work at indeterministic worlds as well as deterministic ones. Let's begin by looking for a theory that will deliver the correct counterfactual verdicts at a deterministic world. We must choose between fixed past, miraculous forks. If I were to choose otherwise, if something happened differently, much of past history would be exactly the same, but the laws would be at least somewhat different. Or fixed laws, no forks. If I were to choose otherwise, or if anything happened differently, the laws would still be exactly the same, but the past would be different all the way back to the remote past. Of course, these both seem unintuitive, but we have to pick one. David Lewis has convinced many, and especially philosophers who work in the literature on causation and counterfactuals, that the first counterfactual is the correct one. For a long time, I was convinced by Lewis's theory, and I defended Lewis against various charges, and even argued in the last chapter of my book that if Lewis is right about counterfactuals, then the counterfactual reasoning endorsed by the naive theory is not so far from the truth, at least so far as our choice counterfactuals are concerned. After all, Lewis tells us that if a deterministic agent had made a choice other than the one she actually made, the past would have been exactly the same until the occurrence of a very small miracle, probably the firing of a different neuron in her brain just before the time of her choice. And he tells us that everything that happens after the small miracle happens according to our laws. This theory seems to combine the predictive power of the naive theory with our common sense assumption that the past is counterfactually independent of the present. And the only price is one small miracle. But now I think, again for reasons independent of free will, that Lewis's theory is wrong and that there is a better theory. Better both in terms of what it tells us about counterfactuals and also better in terms of what it tells us about the relation between counterfactuals, laws, and determinism. Unfortunately, I now have only a bit of time left to explain why I think this. The starting point for thinking about counterfactuals is the possible world semantics and logic developed independently by Lewis and Stahlecker in the early 1970s. The basic idea is simple and maps onto our ordinary way of thinking about counterfactuals. When we try to decide what would happen if, for instance, I dropped this pen, or if a bird suddenly flew into the room, or the fire alarm went off, we do so by imagining a situation very like the actual situation, but which is just different enough so that the antecedent is true. In possible worlds language, this comes out as, if A, it would be that C is true, just in case C is true at the A worlds, most similar to the actual world. Different theories of counterfactuals can be understood as offering different accounts of the relevant notion of similarity. The naive theory says that the most similar A worlds are ones that are exactly like ours with respect to the past and laws. But as we saw, this won't work. Even if we live at the kind of world libertarians think is ours, there will be true counterfactuals, like the one about the bird flying into the room, and we have no reason to suppose that the antecedent of each of these counterfactuals is an event that lacks a deterministic antecedent. In the book in which he introduced his logic for counterfactuals, Lewis told us that we are to use our ordinary notion of overall similarity, the one that we use when we say things like Seattle is more like San Francisco than it is like Los Angeles. Kit Fine famously replied with the counterfactual, if Nixon had pressed the button, there would have been a nuclear holocaust. Since any world with a nuclear holocaust is vastly different from the world we fondly hope is our own, Lewis's similarity metric tells us that this counterfactual is false. But it's easy to stipulate that the facts are such that the counterfactual is true. Okay, I wonder if I could skip this bit. That'll be a short bit. In response to this objection, Lewis proposed and ingeniously defended an extraordinarily ambitious proposal about counterfactuals. He began by noting a striking fact about counterfactuals, that we know a great many counterfactuals that tell us that the future would be different in detailed and specific ways, that the present were different, but the converse is not true. And since it's also a striking fact about our universe, that causes always happen before effects, Lewis proposed that the temporal asymmetry of counterfactual dependence explains the temporal asymmetry of causal dependence, which in turn explains the direction or arrow of time. And I'm going to skip this part, but he basically did this by arguing with great ingenuity that we evaluate counterfactuals by a temporally neutral similarity metric, which basically tells us to balance off exact similarity with respect to a particular fact and similarity with respect to laws. So, and that this would get what the theory that most people know as Lewis's theory, which is a small miracles theory. It will give us, as a matter of contingent fact about a world, the theory that tells us that if Nixon had pressed the button, most of the past would have been exactly the same. There would have been a small miracle, a different neuron firing in his brain. He would have pressed the button and all of the doomsday mechanism would have been in place and there would have been a Holocaust. This was a bit of a tour de force, since the temporally neutral metric is complex and is not something that anyone is likely to claim as their basis for evaluating counterfactuals. It was a very clever argument. Now, matter of historic fact, although many philosophers initially responded to Lewis's theory with horror, all this talk of little and big miracles, it eventually won the day. Even Jonathan Bennett, who defended the simple theory in 1984, eventually came around. I'm a big Lewis fan, and as I've said until very recently, I thought the small miracles theory is correct. I now think that's a mistake. In the last couple of minutes, I will try to explain why. His only positive argument for small miracles was that our beliefs about time's arrow are based on our beliefs that counterfactuals are temporally asymmetric in the way that small miracles say they are. That is, we believe that the past is counterfactually fixed, but the future is at least partly counterfactually open. But this argument fails, as Bennett pointed out way back in 1984. There are lots of standardly true backtracking counterfactuals that say how the past would be if the present were different. For instance, if I were in Los Angeles right now, I would not have slept in my Paris hotel bed last night. I would have got on a plane to LA at least 12 hours ago, and so on. A more dramatic example, if Kennedy had served a second term as president, his 1963 assassination in Dallas would not have occurred, his second inauguration would have occurred, and so on, for some quite specific and determinate facts about the counterfactual past. If the times arrow argument fails, is there any reason to accept small miracles? Well, I think many have been persuaded, and I was for a long time, that if we are not entitled to hold most, or at least much of the past fixed, we will have no idea how to evaluate counterfactuals. For instance, consider the standard, since Nelson Goodman, example of the counterfactual truth we seem to know. I suppose I'm holding a well-made dry match in a room, say this room, with oxygen, no wind, and otherwise favorable conditions. I don't strike the match, but it seems true that if I had struck it, it would have lit. But if we evaluate this counterfactuals by holding the laws rather than the past fixed, how can we say it would light? After all, if determinism is true, then if anything happened differently, all of past history would have been different. If that's the case, who's to say what counterfactuals are true? But if we think this argument works, it's because we are comparing small miracles to a bad alternative theory, one that tells us that the most similar worlds are those with the same laws and which are otherwise most similar overall. And of course, we have no idea what these worlds are like. But the lesson of Kit Fine's Nixon counterfactual is that it's a mistake to try to compare entire worlds in the way we compare cities to one another. Rather, we should construct a similarity metric according to our verdicts about uncontroversially true counterfactual. Lewis claimed that if we do this, we get small miracles. But there is an alternative. It's Bennett's simple theory. Now, in a nutshell, Bennett's simple theory says that the most similar worlds are worlds with the same laws, exactly the same laws as our world, which are otherwise most like our world with respect to exact match a particular fact at the time of the antecedent. By saying this, I think he gets all the benefits of Lewis's theory without the cost. For instance, about the match, it says that the relevant worlds are worlds where the match and its surroundings are pretty much exactly like the way they actually are. The match is dry, well made, there's oxygen, nobody's standing by with a bucket of water, and so on. And of course, at these worlds, if I strike the match, it would light. And more generally, since the past affects the future only by first affecting the present, the simple theory gets the same results as small miracles in the case where small miracles gets the right results. Okay. Couple of reasons why we should accept the simple theory, and then I'm done. First of all, it's simple. No messing about with miracles, comparing little ones to big ones, and so on. It is also, I think, despite the backtracking, much closer to the way we actually think about counterfactuals. After all, we know the past only by knowing the present. So when we evaluate counterfactuals, especially ones, say, about our choices, we take, we're looking for the worlds which are most like the actual world at the present time. So it's closer to the way we actually evaluate counterfactuals. Accommodates Lewis's data, but also handles a broader class of counterfactuals because it's able to account for counterfactual reasoning in both temporal directions. Most importantly, though, it takes the laws seriously, and thereby takes determinism seriously. It respects the platitude that the laws are those counterfactual truths that are true no matter what. Other facts might be different, but the laws are the facts that hold regardless of what we do. So I conclude by saying we should accept Bennett's simple theory, reject Lewis's small miracles. And you might wonder what all of this has to do with free will. Does it make compatibilism easier to defend? No, except in this way. In order to figure out the truth about free will, we need first to understand the truth about the laws and causation. And I've been arguing that to understand this, we need to understand the truth about counterfactuals. So if Bennett's simple theory really is the right theory, as I think it is, then it's the theory that we should use when trying to decide what to think about free will. Yeah.
Thank you very much.